Hi everyone, it's Sandra. Well, today I'm going to use Cinderella as an example to show you how I approximate how much carbon I put in for a typical worm feeding. It's not quite a typical worm feeding today because I'm feeding corn cobs, which are not a typical food source, at least according to how I normally feed my worms. However, I'm going to be using this as an example, and you can see how I ballpark it in terms of trying to get the balance between the higher carbon bedding sources and the higher nitrogen food sources. And I'm going to talk to you a little bit about what the research says about how to do weight calculations versus volume calculations and give you my takeaways on what to do as a domestic worm farmer like myself that's just doing this for my own purposes, and maybe some tips for those of you that are into it for commercial purposes and breeding. All right, let's get into it and see how Cinderella is doing. So let's take a look at my worm bin Cinderella, who's working her way through some lace, as well as the last feeding that she was working her way through some food scraps with pulverized avocado pits. So you can see the level has dropped here, so I assume this was my feeding zone down here. Lots of pill bugs. There was a brand new piece of lace down here and that old scrap of lace, I believe, down here. Hopefully the bin hasn't been rotated, so let's see the old feeding zone. Come on, lift, lift. Oh, so compressed. Oh, got some sticks and stones. Let's see how the lace is doing. Ooh. I can still have a mild citrus smell. So that's when you get citrus peels in your food scraps. You can sometimes smell a mild citrus smell. The lace is dissolving. The microbes have to work their magic, and the bin critters with their chewing teeth, and then the worms will ingest that mush when it goes mushy. So there we go. So there's the old feeding zone. Because I can still smell citrus, it doesn't mean that there is still food left in the bin. It could just be the essential oil from citrus. But obviously the worms are still active in this area. That stick is going to stab me. Those are going to take a while. Those are like chopsticks. I was told by a kind viewer that Prince Charming is down in this corner, so I'll look for him when I get to it. All right, so there's my old feeding zone with the lace. Let's feed Cinderella back in this zone, and we'll take a look at the first piece of lace I put in. Again, I assume it's going to be totally gone. So I'm kind of doing a ping pong thing with feedings, end to end, which ensures the worms travel through the full length of material. There's one of my Vancouver Island worms. Oh, more purpley than it is red. Stuck in the lace, but I'm not worried. They can worm their way out. All right, so let's just turn this back over, this old feeding zone. Oh, there's an avocado pit. There's one, that's the one that was cleaved. So you see, it's going to take forever for the worms to get in there until, there we go, until it breaks open just a little bit, and then the worms will hollow it out. Okay, let's turn over this other end, and I'll feed down this end with the browns and the greens that I have set aside according to weight. So in the worm research, the researchers have developed a very complicated math formula that I'll put up on the screen here, because everything, whether it be a brown or a green, has a different carbon to nitrogen ratio, and they want to have a precise measurement. For a domestic worm farmer, that's just not going to be possible unless you know exactly what your food scraps contain and exactly what your bedding contains. And you can plug it into that math formula. If you're a worm breeder, you might want to do that. If you're feeding a chow that has a defined carbon to nitrogen ratio and your bedding source is a recipe that you use reliably from time to time. For most of us, though, That's just not going to be possible. So what I want to show you in this video is how a very typical feeding of bedding that I would add to Cinderella every time I feed her. It was about 2 liters of dried leaves or about half a gallon. How that actually translates in terms of volume and weight, and how when I saw those results, I changed how I was going to feed this bin. And hopefully, if you're feeding carbon sources that have a lot of air spaces in them, whether that be dried leaves like I did, or even corrugated cardboard that has a lot of air to it, you might want to rethink whether you are really getting at that 2 to 3 times the volume of carbon as you are your higher nitrogen food sources with each feeding, especially if you are pulverizing your food. So as an example, I took what I considered to be a typical serving of dried leaves that I would give my worms, put it in my dedicated food processor for my worm food, and I whizzed them up to see how much volume it would occupy. I was really surprised at how these leaves crunched down, and they only weighed 1 ounce. So you can see both in terms of volume and weight, these leaves don't measure up to be very much at all. Now, this is something that would be very difficult to do as an ongoing basis. If you don't know, this is my haircut, gradually getting eaten. The keratin in the fibers, the worms can put it to good use. So let's look for Prince Charming, and let's look for that piece of lace as I hollow out this end. So doing calculations using weight is difficult for, just somebody like me who's a home worm farmer. It is something that, the research gave an approximate calculation saying that your food scraps on average are going to be about 80% moisture, so you don't have to dry them to get a dried weight. Now, somebody like Anne from Plant Obsessed, who's using one of those food composters, does have an accurate dried weight. Oh, there's Prince Charming. Yay! There's a peach pit. Where's that lace? So Anne from Plant Obsessed does have an accurate measure of dried weight. I still have some questions about whether the food that's gone through one of those food composters that dry them so thoroughly would slow a bin down, because the microbes basically have to start from scratch, given that the material itself would be sterile coming out of there. That's not to say the microbes don't get into it, of course they do, but they're starting from scratch, whereas food scraps that have not been dried to that extent, there are still living enzymes, living microbes, even if you freeze them. Freezing isn't going to slow the microbes that down. What is this, a rock? I have no idea. Looks like a dried fig, but I don't think I've put a dried anything fig-like in here. Have no idea. It's rock hard. Okay, so let's feed this bin. Now, the leaves that I set aside, I actually spilled a little bit of them into another carbon. That's okay, it's coming in too. The leaves that I set aside were 1 ounce. This 1 ounce of leaves is not 100% carbon. In fact, because this is leaves, it is 30 to 1. It's about 30 to 1 carbon to nitrogen. So it's already a perfect ratio for this worm bin. That means that by adding food scraps, when I add the corn, I am disrupting that ratio, because if the leaves are already a perfect 30 to 1, every time I add higher nitrogen foods, it's going to decrease the carbon to nitrogen ratio away from that ideal 30 to 1. You can actually see from those numbers on corn that it's not skewed that much towards the higher nitrogen. In fact, between the higher carbon in it as well as the lignin and the cellulose, it takes a long time to decompose. But if you're using a diversity of food scraps like I normally do, you know that it is going to skew your carbon to nitrogen ratio way too much. I'm adding some high carbon browns. These are pulverized and slightly aged for about 2-3 months. Wood chips with some small twigs. Wood has a much higher carbon to nitrogen ratio than leaves do, so that's going to skew the carbon a little bit towards the browns again. I could throw in something like a toilet roll or some cardboard, which has very high carbon to nitrogen ratio. And by doing that, again, I'm giving the worms some ready carbon to offset the higher nitrogen food scraps. I'm going to add some of my compost mixture. This not only has carbon in it, but it also has a lot of microbes. So it's really going to kickstart those dry leaves and this cardboard. The sawdust also has microbes or the small wood chips that I put in. So you see how I'm trying to balance by adding some carbon sources that will skew the ratio back into the carbon rich area, because I want my worm bin to always err on the side or a higher carbon to nitrogen ratio than a conventional compost bin. If the carbon to nitrogen ratio drops too low, you risk overheating, you risk protein poisoning, you risk getting that stinky, swampy, anaerobic conditions. I'm not risking it with these corn on the cobs. In fact, it's going to take months for the worms to totally eat all this corn, but there was one cob in there that has corn in it. So and Cinderella doesn't have a huge population, so I want to be a little bit careful. Anyway, I hope that gave you a little bit of clarity, probably more confusion than clarity, on how to judge how many browns to put into your worm bins. Do you want to do it by volume? If you want to do it by volume, which is the easier way to do it, I'll just bury this here. If you want to do it by volume, the research says the best thing to do is, first of all, know how high a carbon your browns are, and if it is a very high on the carbon end, like cardboard, you could go like 2-to-1 volume with pulverized food scraps, and you should be just fine. If it is a lower carbon, like leaves or the flower waste that I was picking up, if you've got a lower carbon on the carbon to nitrogen scale, then you'll want to go at least 3-to-1 volume. But be aware, when I pulverized those leaves down, the volume dropped dramatically. So when you're comparing volume, you'll want to compare apples to apples to make sure that you are comparing volume of pulverized food scraps with volume of pulverized or shredded carbon versus those whole leaves that I had and a pulverized food scrap. All right, so that's Cinderella set up. We're going to come back and we're going to see the worm party the next time we visit her. All right, everyone. Bye for now.